Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. I'm Captain James Bollinger and you're watching the Sussex Smuggler. Today we're going to explore the fascinating yet notorious history of the Hawkhurst Gang, a group of smugglers whose operations in 18th century England may very well mark the birth of organised crime as we know it. The Hawkhurst Gang wasn't just a band of petty criminals. They were a well-organised syndicate with influence, violence and connections reaching into the heart of British politics. Their story is not only significant because of the damage they inflicted on society, but also because of the legacy they left behind in shaping the world of organised crime. Today we're going to delve into the fascinating and tumultuous period of British history, the years between 1740 and 1750, a decade marked by war politics and one of Britain's first organised crime syndicates, the Hawkhurst Gang. This period saw immense upheaval, not just on the battlefield, but also at home, where smuggling was rampant, taxes were fiercely contested, and the government under Prime Minister Robert Walpole tried to wrestle control of a society under pressure. To fully understand the significance of this time, we need to place it within its broader European context. The 1740s were a decade of war. Europe was once again embroiled in conflict, with Britain caught up in a series of interconnected wars. One of the most notable conflicts was the War of Austrian Succession, which pitted major European powers against each other over territorial claims after the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. This was preceded by the War of Jenkins' Ear, which began in 1739 and mostly involved Britain and Spain clashing in the Caribbean and the West Indies. The War of Jenkins' Ear, named after a British captain who supposedly had his ear cut off by Spanish forces, was a flashpoint for British pride and anti-Spanish sentiment, and it inflamed public opinion back home. These wars were expensive militarily, economically and politically. The costs of sustaining these conflicts were immense, and it was within the financial strain that the issue of taxation and smuggling became critically important. At the centre of this turbulent decade was Robert Walpole, Britain's longest serving Prime Minister, who held office from 1721 to 1742. By the time we reached the 1740s, Walpole had been in power for over 2 decades, and his leadership was increasingly challenged. Though known for his pragmatic approach to governance and his efforts to maintain peace through diplomacy, Walpole faced mounting opposition from both Tories and elements within his own Whig party, as well as public outcry over taxation and the cost of war. One of the most significant issues Walpole faced was smuggling. In the 18th century, smuggling was a widespread problem, exacerbated by high taxes on goods like tea, tobacco and wine. These goods were smuggled in large quantities to avoid the heavy customs duties imposed by the government. In many cases, entire communities were involved in smuggling operations, and the practice was often viewed as a lesser evil or even a form of resistance against perceived unfair taxation. Walpole recognised that smuggling was not just an economic problem, but a political one. It eroded the government's ability to raise revenue and emboldened opposition factions who aligned themselves with the anti-tax sentiment. Smuggling gangs like the notorious Hawkhurst Gang flourished during this time, particularly in the southern coastal regions of England. These gangs not only defied the tax laws but also engaged in acts of violence and intimidation, creating a parallel economy and undermining the state's authority. In a bold move to address these issues, Walpole made a famous speech to Parliament proposing new taxes on wine and tobacco, two of the most smuggled goods in Britain. This was part of his broader strategy to curtail smuggling and regain control of Britain's customs revenue. The tax on wine and tobacco, however, wasn't just about economics. It was a calculated political manoeuvre designed to strike at the heart of his opponents. Walpole knew that both the Tories and certain Whig factions were sympathetic to the smugglers, or at least to the anti-tax sentiment that was growing amongst the public. By proposing these taxes, he put pressure on these factions to either support his efforts to clamp down on smuggling or openly oppose measures to protect the country's revenue. It was a move designed to expose the contradictions in his opponents' positions. Were they for law and order, or were they defending criminal smuggling networks under the guise of opposing taxes? The political backlash was immediate. Both Tories and elements within Walpole's own Whig party saw the tax as an attack on their support base. For many, it represented an attempt to increase government control at the expense of personal freedoms and local economies. These taxes became a flashpoint in the broader debate about the role of government taxation and the balance between enforcing the law and allowing the economy to thrive. In this context, the Hawkhurst Gang emerged as a key player. Operating in the 1740s, they were one of the most notorious smuggling gangs in Britain, with influence stretching from the southern coast of England all the way to London. The Hawkhurst Gang's operations focused on exactly the goods that Walpole was trying to control: wine, tobacco, tea and spirits. Their violent methods and highly organised structure set them apart from other smuggling rings. They ruled their territory with fear, using brutality to ensure loyalty and silence opposition. The Hawkhurst Gang's rise to prominence during this decade illustrates how deeply embedded smuggling was in British society at the time. Their ability to operate with impunity for so long was a direct challenge to the government's authority. They controlled significant smuggling routes and even had connections with corrupt officials, demonstrating how organised crime could thrive in the shadows of political turmoil. The gang's influence stretched beyond their criminal activities. Smuggling was seen by many as a legitimate protest against what were perceived to be unfair taxes. In some cases, communities would rally around the smugglers, who were often seen as folk heroes. The Hawkhurst Gang's violent reign, however, began to change this perception, especially when their brutal actions, including the torture and murder of customs officers, shocked the public. Walpole's political career came to an end in 1742, partly as a result of his failure to quell the opposition against his taxation policies and the increasing unpopularity of his administration. His resignation marked the beginning of a new era in British politics, but the issues he had grappled with, war, taxation and smuggling, continued to dominate British society. We now turn back to look at Walpole's initial efforts to curb smuggling through legislation, proving largely ineffective. Smuggling had become so deeply entrenched in society that enforcement through laws alone seemed impossible. Faced with this failure, Walpole had to rethink his strategy. Rather than relying solely on legislation, he turned his focus to changing the tactics employed by customs officials in fighting the smugglers. In 1733, a committee was established to investigate the scale and mechanisms of smuggling. The findings were staggering. One of the major commodities that evaded taxation was tobacco, which, as the committee reported, escaped the authorities through fraudulent bookkeeping and bribes. But it wasn't just tobacco. Tea and brandy were also among the most smuggled goods, primarily coming through the southern coastlines and finding their way into London markets. Smugglers operated in organised gangs, some of which were so brazen that they physically assaulted customs officers. Over a span of 10 years, there were reports of 250 customs officers being attacked. The scale of smuggling was immense. The committee has estimated that around 251,000 tonnes of tea and a staggering 653,000 gallons of brandy were smuggled into London, and this was likely to be a conservative figure. The reality was thought to be even worse. More than 2,000 individuals were prosecuted for smuggling tea alone, and 229 ships involved in smuggling activities were captured. What does this tell us about Britain at the time? First and foremost, smuggling wasn't just an underground activity carried out by a few. It was a widespread, organised and even violent business that involved a significant portion of the population. Despite Walpole's best efforts to clamp down on the trade, smuggling thrived, fed by public demand and a thriving black market. The entrenched corruption within the customs office, coupled with the sheer size of the operation, made it extremely difficult for the government to respond effectively. Walpole's experience with smuggling shows us how sometimes traditional legislative solutions simply don't work when faced with deeply rooted economic and social behaviours. It also underscores the evolving relationship between the government and the people, especially when that relationship is mediated through unpopular taxes and high demand for goods like tea, tobacco and brandy. Ultimately, while Walpole's attempts to reform customs procedures represented a shift in strategy, it would take much longer for smuggling to be effectively controlled in Britain. Smuggling remained a significant issue, and it would take broader economic and policy changes to truly address it. A certain witness was giving testimony to the committee by the name of Gabriel Tonkin, who hailed from Tunbridge Wells, Kent, who played a significant role in the transformation of smuggling in 18th century England. In his prime, he led the infamous Mayfield Gang, a ruthless band of smugglers who were far from the romanticised image often associated with such criminals. Smuggling in the public mind was sometimes seen as a defiant act of resistance against taxes, an almost heroic or adventurous crime. But Tonkins and men like him transformed it into something far darker, a violent, organised criminal enterprise. By the time Tonkins reached his 40s, he was a hardened criminal. His body bore the scars of this life, including a wound where a musket ball passed through him, clear evidence of the dangers and violence that accompanied his chosen path. His criminal career began in his 20s when he was first arrested for smuggling in 1716, and over the next decade he found himself in and out of prison, never able to fully escape the law. Despite many brushes with justice, Tonkins remained one of the most wanted men in England. There was £100 reward on his head, a considerable sum in those days, showing just how determined the authorities were to bring him to justice. Yet even the most hardened criminals have their limits. Eventually Tonkins entered into a plea bargain, no doubt realising that his luck was running out. He agreed to give evidence to the committee, likely hoping that it might reduce his sentence or spare him further punishment. Tonkins' testimony was significant. Not only did it reveal the inner workings of the smuggling networks, but it also helped the authorities better understand how the crime had evolved. Smuggling was no longer about individual acts of defiance against the Crown's taxes. It was a sophisticated, organised trade fueled by violence and coercion. Men like Tonkins thrived in this new environment, but it was a dangerous game, one that he eventually lost. Gabriel Tonkin's life serves as a reminder of how crime, when left unchecked, can evolve into something far more dangerous. His role in turning smuggling into a violent and organised trade left a lasting mark on England's history. And though his life of crime may have brought him short-term gains, it also led him to prison and ultimately to betray his former comrades in an attempt to save himself. Tonkins informed the committee how tea was his preferred contraband, how it would be brought in by ship from Amsterdam. Tonkins would import tea in bulk, as much as 20 tons per shipment. The tea would be landed on a location along the Kent or Sussex coast, then moved to stash houses some 5 miles from London. This was a time when smuggling was rampant along the southern coast, particularly in East Sussex and Kent. In response, the British government took dramatic measures to stem this illegal trade, which brings us to the key figures in this effort: John Collier and Gabriel Tonkin. Smuggling wasn't just a small-time operation. By the mid-1700s, it had grown into a highly organised and widespread activity, with gangs stretching across Europe and the British Isles. Heavy taxation on goods such as tea, tobacco and alcohol made smuggling not just appealing but highly profitable. Europe's ports such as Dunkirk, Boulogne and Amsterdam acted as safe havens for these smugglers. Goods flowed through these ports, including vast quantities of tea, often supplied by the Dutch East India Company, which had a global trading monopoly. The Channel Islands, with their own autonomy, also played a part, functioning as both a transit point and sanctuary for smugglers. The British government knew that smuggling was undermining both the economy and the rule of law, so they responded with a new, more aggressive strategy to root it out. One of the most important figures in this campaign was John Collier, the Surveyor General of the Riding Officers and a prosecutor for East Sussex and Kent. Collier came from Eastbourne, the son of a local landlord, and was deeply familiar with the region's geography and its people. His role was to enforce the law along the notoriously smuggler-friendly coastline of southern England, where vast, isolated stretches made it easy for the Hawkhurst Gang to unload their contraband. Collier, however, was actively involved in touring East Sussex and Kent. His role as Surveyor General was to inspect and organise riding officers, a role introduced in 1690 to combat smuggling. Now, in a rather ironic twist, we now have Gabriel Tonkin, a former smuggler himself, who was deputised as a customs officer and stationed in Rye, East Sussex, and tasked with tracking down his former colleagues. The old saying, poacher turned gamekeeper, fits Tonkin perfectly. His deep understanding of how smuggling operations worked from the inside gave him a unique advantage in his new role as a smuggler hunter. Tonkin was able to anticipate the tactics of the smugglers, knowing their hiding spots, routes and even some of their secret codes. His conversion to law enforcement proved the perfect cover in setting up a sophisticated smuggling operation in Rye of his own, and was likely to feed Collier's strategies to his colleagues in the Hawkhurst Gang. He has the power of seizing goods and then selling them on. As mentioned earlier, smuggling was not just a local issue, but had international dimensions. The French port of Dunkirk, for instance, was notorious for turning a blind eye to the activities of smugglers. Similarly, Boulogne offered sanctuary to these lawbreakers, creating a cross-channel smuggling network that stretched far beyond Britain's shores. This arrangement suited the Hawkhurst Gang. Amsterdam was perhaps the most crucial hub in this network. The city was Europe's tea capital, with supplies largely coming from the Dutch East India Company, which dominated trade routes in Asia. As demand for tea grew in Britain, particularly since it was heavily taxed, smugglers saw an opportunity to bring in cheaper, untaxed tea. This illegal tea trade became one of the most lucrative smuggling operations, challenging both British customs officials and legitimate traders. But the challenge was monumental, with European ports like Dunkirk, Boulogne and Amsterdam turning a blind eye to smuggling, and the Channel ports providing a local refuge for the Hawkhurst Gang. Britain faced a truly international problem. Yet through the combined efforts of customs officers, the fight against smuggling in East Sussex and Kent became one of the pivotal battlegrounds in the larger effort to restore law and order to Britain's coasts. The first and significant account of the Hawkhurst Gang was in 1735. One of Collier's riding officers, Thomas Carswell, received intelligence of a landing at Hastings. The shipment of contraband was then going to be moved by horse and cart inland to one of the gang's stash houses. Carswell with his dragoons waited in ambush at Hollington, somewhat inland. Carswell ambushed the convoy, shooting first. The shots could be heard in Hastings. Then some of the smugglers made it back to the stash house in Turner's Hole. Some fled, but one was found dead, Thomas Peen, a carpenter of Hawkhurst, Kent. Meanwhile, in Westminster, Robert Walpole managed to make some progress with the introduction of new legislation in 1736. The conditions were offered as a pardon for smuggling offences before the 17th of April 1736, except offences which included murder. Informants would be offered pardons and bounties. Assembling by the coast was made unlawful, and all assaults on customs officers would be tried in London to bypass local sentiment in the courts. Meanwhile, in Rye, Gabriel Tonkin was promoted to the customs service. Whilst keeping his side hustle of smuggling on the boil, Tonkins was promoted to Sheriff's Bailiff of Sussex. With the amount of tea confiscated, Tonkins became a minor celebrity in the newspapers of London. Tonkins, with an arrest warrant, then made a move to arrest Thomas More. However, the associates of More intervened and gave Tonkins £300, that's £53,000 in today's money, for a bail bond. Seems like a bribe to me. That evening, the gang raided Tonkin's room in the Mermaid Inn in Rye. Tonkins refused to give the money back, so they grabbed him and put him on a boat bound for France. Luckily for Tonkins, a sloop captain, Nathaniel Pigram, found him on board before setting sail to France. John Collier, Surveyor General of the riding officers, visited Tonkins after the rescue and clarified that the warrant of arrest had no jurisdiction in Rye, as the town was a Cinque Port. This, of course, might have been the sting on Tonkin's part to secure the money, and it may have been later in the day that the gang realised this and so decided to pay Tonkins a visit at the Mermaid Inn. Tonkins deputised a man called Thomas Black, who was confiscating goods at gunpoint for Tonkins and his racket. Collier received a tip-off about the racket, and Gabriel Tonkins resigned his commission and went on the run. In 1736, tea smuggling was booming on the Kent-Sussex coast. Law enforcement and the justice system was too weak and corrupt to deal with the growing problem. The Hawkhurst Gang turned the southeast corner of England into a no-go area for law enforcement, and the gang was quickly evolving into a paramilitary force. By 1744, the Hawkhurst Gang had wiped out law enforcement in the region. Riding officers and customs officers were demoted to just observers, outnumbered and outgunned. The gang utilised the natural shingle peninsula Dungeness in Kent to daily land tons of tea. Records kept by riding officers indicate the gang was being led by Arthur Gray and Trip Stanford. Officers observed the whole logistical operation, with hundreds of men, carts and horses showing up daily to unload cutters from Europe. The Hawkhurst Gang was made up of several branches, most likely a confederation of several gangs in the area. The different branches controlled different routes and logistical stages. For example, Jeremiah Curtis with Captain Grayling of the Hastings Outlaws Transport Gang provided the cutters. The cutters were crucial in ferrying contraband between France and the Kent-Sussex coast. The transport name came from Captain Grayling, who was transported to Australia for 7 years for the murder of a sailor on a customs vessel in 1736, and managed somehow to find his passage back to Boulogne, where he lived. In 1744, Grayling's cutter was attacked, and he was remanded by John Collier. Grayling, who was a Sir, was pardoned and joined the Royal Navy with a deal made with the Duke of Newcastle. The arrest of Grayling ended the transport gang. Curtis, left with the remnants of the outlaws, merged with the Hawkhurst Gang. The Transports Gang were politically allied to the Jacobite cause and swore allegiance to France. This allegiance gave them safe haven and convenient access to the French warehouses selling goods. The Transport Gang mainly dealt with shipping, and the Hawkhurst Gang the land movement of goods. The Hawkhurst Gang, led by Arthur Gray, would win people over with one policy: silver or lead, or as Pablo Escobar would have said, plato o plomo. In March 1744, Walpole, after the longest premiership ever departed, tired and defeated over the smuggling question. His successor, Henry Pelham, took over the premiership and carried on the impetus against the Hawkhurst Gang. He appointed his brother, the Duke of Newcastle, as Secretary of State, who has established his own smugglers used to establish intelligence on the Hawkhurst Gang. Newcastle used a smuggler by the name of Abraham Walter. Walter travelled to Boulogne and Dunkirk. Walter witnessed a pre-invasion force of regular French troops, Jacobite and English troops, and Irish rebels. The vessels were preparing for sailing. There was an additional 20,000 muskets for English dissenters in Kent and Sussex, as the English crown had lost control of these counties. The invasion force was planning to land in Pevensey and build a bridgehead from there, assisted by the Hawkhurst Gang and their allies. The information was passed back to Newcastle and caused the British government grave concern. Now, returning to the anti-smuggler legislation of 1736, which by 1740 was making an impact with its built-in protections for informants. However, the Hawkhurst Gang still operated without fear because of their political connections, which kept them from the rope. Nobody had been successfully convicted of the Thomas Carswell murder so far. One customs officer in 1743 by the name of Parker decided to intervene in a landing and was threatened at gunpoint. Officer Darby, whose house was in Lydd and observed the daily landings at Dungeness, put names to Collier, but that was about the strength of it. Officer Darby and Freebody attempted a seizure, but were overpowered by the gang and were kidnapped to Boulogne. Some of the kidnapped were never seen again. Some were put on board French galleys to serve as oarsmen and never returned to England. Some were less fortunate, resulting with a funeral at sea. Attacks by the gang escalated with the normal rules of engagement between smuggler and officer being ripped up. Darby, for example, was paid a visit at home by the gang, now making things personal. The violence spread towards London at one of the gang's stash houses in Kennington Lane, London in 1743. A 3-hour shootout took place between some members of the Hawkhurst Gang and 20 customs officers and musketeers. A conditional ceasefire was made, with damages being paid to the house as long as the tea was moved. Yet another example of the gang's impunity. Smugglers hunters were appointed, and their efforts, and in particular in November 1744, Thomas Quaife, a Hawkhurst man, arrested Thomas Jockey Tom Carey in a London pub on suspicion of the murder of Thomas Carswell. The arrest of high-level members of the gang must have spooked some members, as the arrest based on information by fellow gang member Club James. In striking back, the gang, 100 strong, marched into an army barracks at Bexhill in Sussex. The troops put up little resistance, and the gang took their weapons and beat the troops up. Riding Officer Bailey stopped collaborating with the gang. His home was raided and destroyed, but Bailey escaped. The gang then turned to Officer Walsh and his home, where they tortured him. Bailey, allied with soldiers, went in hot pursuit and killed one of the smugglers with a bayonet to the chest. The escalation made the government dispatch 4 cavalry troops into Kent and Sussex. In December 1744, smuggler hunters Thomas Quaife, James Bolton and Club James were stuck in the King's Head Inn, Shoreham in Kent, following a lead. Curtis and some of his 8 Hawkhurst Gang associates, heavily armed, laid siege to the inn. To force the surrender, the gang threatened to burn the inn down. Quaife escaped, but Bolton and Club James, a former member of the Hawkhurst Gang, were captured. The captured customs men were mounted on horses, hands tied behind their back, and had their legs tied to the stirrups. The name of the Jacobite was James Bishop, brother of prominent MP and a pro-smuggler, although it was never proven he was an actual smuggler, Cecil Bishop, who was trying to escape following the defeat of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite army. In a strange twist, the Hoe smugglers led by Jockey Tom recaptured Bishop, who was eventually transported to London after being remanded into an inn in Hoe, possibly the Red Lion. James Bishop declared himself a political prisoner and paid no fees to the innkeeper. The newspapers were reporting again that the Hawkhurst Gang looked every bit a standing army. The newspapers started labelling the smugglers as rebels, claiming to swear allegiance to Bonnie Prince Charlie and that they wore a uniform. Rumours were rife about an Irishman in a French uniform drilling smugglers like a regiment, and may have been a tactic to sell newspapers at the time. In March 1746, Parliament held another inquiry into smuggling and published a report. Its findings made for interesting reading and must have made the Treasury frown. Its recommendation was to further reduce duty on tea. Britain was a big smuggling nation despite duty reductions on tea. The duty still made tea more expensive than the smuggled tea. The UK imported £4 million of tea per annum. Only 800,000 of imported tea paid duty. The rest, 80%, was smuggled. Only 5% of smuggled tea was seized by customs. The loss was acceptable to the likes of the Hawkhurst Gang. Abraham Walter, whilst detained in Newgate on a smuggling charge, gave evidence to Parliament. He declared his brother was a tea merchant in Middleburg. The Hawkhurst Gang could muster 500 men in 1 hour for a channel run. Customs raids on stash houses had an effect on the Hawkhurst Gang supply chains. The gangs used duffers to smuggle small amounts of tea into London and avoid detection. 90% of the local population was willing to help smugglers. Customs officers stated pardons had to go further than the 1736 anti-smuggling law and protect informants that committed murder. In the Far East, the Royal Navy seized 2 French tea ships, making up 13% of the gang supply chain, which was destined for the British market. The Dutch East India Company purchased tea and cargo and sailed in them into Amsterdam. This had a detrimental effect on the Hawkhurst Gang's supply chain. 13% was a massive impact. The Dutch sold the tea to gangs in Anglia, who did not have troops based around them, and the Navy was not patrolling the coastline. Suffolk and Norfolk gangs could run straight into Holland to make their purchases unharassed. Market conditions had now changed for the Hawkhurst Gang, with their supply of tea disrupted. The gang began to diversify into other criminal markets and enterprises. Housebreaking, highway robberies, and protection rackets became a means to plug the income gap from the absence of French tea. The new criminal enterprises, however, had a knock-on effect to public support as it declined, as it directly affected them. The gang was chased out of Lewes by a militia, something unthinkable before. In April 1746, the gang raided a warehouse of port wine recovered from a wreck. They cut the guard's throat and hung the body nearby. Kidnappings of customs officers and militia was common. These were lean times for the gang. With the lean times continuing, the gang turned on each other. Arthur Gray robbed Samuel Hill of £150, nearly killing him in the process. The gang used their own crews to work when the runs of contraband became lean. Hill was Curtis's man, and William Gray, Arthur's brother, paid the money back to put peace between the crews. A new anti-smuggling bill passed through Parliament, becoming law. The conditions of this legislation passes the onus onto the suspects. Amnesty could be granted if smugglers paid tax owed before the 24th of April 1746. The legislation introduced a requirement on suspected smugglers to surrender themselves to the authority if they were named in the Gazette within 40 days. If they failed to surrender, a bounty of £500 would be placed on their arrest. Suspects would be tried in London, away from juries open to be influenced or involved in smuggling. Notification in the Gazette was distributed locally, and the legislation would expire after 7 years because of its tyrannical circumstances, and rich smugglers would instruct lawyers to challenge the legislation in court. The legislation would give the smugglers a choice of stay at large or be put down like the Jacobite rebels and comply with the law. It was in September 1746 that our old friend Gabriel Tonkin surfaced with his accomplice Nathaniel Miller in Rye. Tonkins was still at large and on the run, and Tonkins had robbed the Chester mail coach and had arrived in Rye. The constables of Rye were alerted. Tonkins and Miller made an escape, but Miller was shot in the back, falling from his horse dead. Tonkins sped off on his horse and remained at large. The people of Kent and Sussex patience were growing thin. The gang were committing more robberies and entering towns threatening people. The people of Goudhurst and nearby Cranbrook decided to take a stand. On the 21st of April 1747, 14 Goudhurst men took up defensive positions in the village led by William Sturt, former soldier from the European War. 15 Hawkhurst Gang members rode into Goudhurst and fired on the militia. The militia returned fire and a firefight ensued. 2 smugglers were killed, George Kingsmill, who murdered Officer Carswell, and 1 other. The gang fled Goudhurst. The Battle of Goudhurst, as it was called by the London newspapers, was a turning point for the Hawkhurst Gang, which was only going to spiral downwards. In March 1747, the Hawkhurst Gang, with Gabriel Tonkin and the Folkestone Gang, unloaded 11 tons of tea at Reculver, Kent. Customs plus militia turned up to take the tea. The Folkestone Gang escaped with 3 tons of tea plus liquor, leaving the Tonkins and the Hawkhurst Gang to shoot it out with customs. Curtis and the Hawkhursts caught up later with the Folkestone Gang and took their horses and gave them a beating. In revenge, and more to the point, to save themselves, the Folkestone Gang confessed to the authorities the smuggling activities of the Hawkhurst Gang. The Hawkhurst's names were then listed in the Gazette as wanted under the anti-smuggling law of April 1747. One of the names was John Cook, who was arrested by dragoons in June 1747 and remanded into Newgate. Cook, standing trial and under the law at the Old Bailey, was no ordinary smuggler. He was servant to William Gray, one of the leaders of the Hawkhurst Gang. Aid or duty solicitor funded by the state to defend people. You either had the money to hire or you defended yourself. One such defence lawyer on the availability list was an Irish Catholic lawyer called Mr. Kelly. Kelly had a pool of witnesses and could conjure up stories out of nowhere if you had the money. The ability of some members of the Hawkhurst Gang to have the funds to afford a defence lawyer was a good indicator as to how wealthy they were. For the prosecution of these high-profile cases was William Murray, Solicitor General, and Dudley Ryder, Attorney General of the UK. Tickner and James Poison Hodges were tried together under the old 1736 legislation, as the charges were much stronger. The prosecution witness was Officer James Bolton, who was able to testify about his abduction and witness both Tickner and Hodges' smuggling on Dungeness. Both were found guilty and transported to the new colonies of America. Fuller was tried for smuggling and carrying firearms on the coast, witnessed by Officer James Bolton at Dungeness. Fuller found guilty and was hung. Samuel Austin was charged the same as Fuller and convicted and hung. One of his witnesses committed perjury, undermining Austin's case. Austin was ultimately hung. The convictions sent a strong message to the gang. However, the big names are still missing. The Gray brothers, Curtis was on the run, likely to be in Boulogne by now, and of course Trip Stanford. However, in October of 1747, Arthur and William Gray was arrested by the Cranbrook Association. William Gray had accumulated so much wealth that he had built a £1,500 house. William Gray's occupation, however, was listed as a butcher, somewhat suspiciously. William Gray was remanded into Newgate, but later escaped with another smuggler, Thomas Kemp. Fellow gang members helped hatch the plan from outside. William Gray fled into Sussex and Kent, and he was rearrested, tried, and sentenced to transportation. However, William was struck with jail fever and died in Newgate. As for Arthur Gray, riding officer John Poole escorted local blacksmith John Pelham, who gave evidence at the Old Bailey. Arthur Gray, leader of the Hawkhurst Gang, was convicted and hung on the 11th of May 1748. Trip Stanford, also a wealthy smuggler, lived in a £700 farmhouse, and he was wanted for the Carswell murder. In September 1747, a cutter was making its way to Poole, Dorset. The Chichester gang tried to land goods from a different route in an effort to improve their income gap. The plan was to land the cutter on a rural Dorset coastline. However, the cutter was spotted by a customs vessel, and with warning shots fired, the cutter put in Poole. The cutter had on board 3 tons of tea. The tea was confiscated and stored in the Poole Customs House. The Chichester gang employed the services of the Hawkhurst gang to retrieve the tea. They set out from horseback to retrieve the tea from Poole Customs House from Kent. The Hawkhurst gang stopped at Constitution Hill outside of Poole to survey the harbour below. They sent 2 scouts ahead to make a more detailed assessment of the Customs House area. A customs sloop was docked near the Customs House and could prove a threat to any raid by the gang. The Chichester gang turned their horses around, thinking the job impossible. However, what the Hawkhurst gang, made up of 30 heavily armed men, worked out that because of the low tide, the sloop would not be able to train its guns inland. So the Hawkhurst gang broke into the Customs House. They stumbled upon a night fisherman and took him with them. As they made their way they encountered nobody, only 2 unarmed guards asleep in the Customs House. There was no bloodshed, and so the tea was loaded onto their horses, and the 2 gangs made off with the loot. They made for Brook in the New Forest, where they weighed out the tea before breaking up into 2 separate convoys. The convoy then broke up, with Thomas Kingsmill and John Diamond riding through Fording Bridge in Hampshire. A crowd gathered in the town to cheer the gang on and give a hero's welcome. It was at this point that a pivotal event took place. Daniel Chater, resident shoemaker, recognised John Diamond. Diamond saw Chater in the crowd and tossed him a bag of tea. They knew each other from working the land together at harvest time. Upon splitting up after the Poole raid, some of the gang, namely John Smoker Mills and Jeremiah Butler Curtis, chose a different route via Yapton in West Sussex and stashed tea at a barn. On the 13th of January 1748, they returned for their stash of tea and found the innocent Richard Hawkins working out of the barn thrashing corn. Mills and Curtis accused Hawkins of stealing their tea. Hawkins denied it. The Hawkhurst pair produced their pistols and forced Richard Hawkins to go with them to the Dog and Partridge pub at Slindon Common in West Sussex. At the pub, two more of the Hawkhurst gang waited in a back room. They were Thomas Winter of Polling near Arundel and Rob Little Fat Back of East Grinstead, servant to Curtis. The gang forced Hawkins to strip to his waist and beat him to death. Hawkins was never seen alive again. His body was found 9 months later at Parham Parks Lake. Hawkins protested his innocence to the gang. The fact was, Hawkins did not steal any tea. It was the gang that missed a bag. Tragically, Hawkins paid the price, and so did his family. Hawkins left behind a wife and children. The coroner ruled that his death was murder by people unknown. Meanwhile, Daniel Chater learned of the reward being offered by the Crown and sent a letter to Mr. Shearer, Collector of Customs at Southampton, stating he had seen Diamond passing through Fordingbridge the day after the raid at Poole. In receiving this news, Shearer dispatched William Galley, Revenue Officer, to escort Chater to see the Surveyor General Major Batten for West Sussex. Chater was to make a statement to Batten to confirm the identity of Diamond. Diamond was arrested and remanded in custody at Chichester Jail. On the 14th of February 1748, Chater and Galley set out for East Murden near Chichester, their route taking them via Stansted near Rowlands Castle. It was at the New Inn in Lee where things started to turn sour for Galley and Chater. At the New Inn, Chater and Galley met brothers George and Thomas Austin. The Austin brothers were blacksmiths by day, and guess what, smugglers at night. The Austin brothers then escorted Chater and Galley to the White Hart Inn at Rowlands Castle, owned by Elizabeth Payne. Payne offered Galley and Chater rum. Elizabeth Payne and George Austin concluded that they were going to give evidence against the smugglers involved at Poole with a letter to the magistrate, Major Batten. The Austins sent for two other smugglers, William Carter and William Jackson. Galley and Chater wanted their horses, but Payne stalled them in time for Carter and Jackson. Other smugglers turned up: William Steele, Samuel Downer, Edmund Richards and Henry Shearman. William Jackson took Chater, intoxicated, into the yard to confess. Chater disclosed why he was there to Jackson. With this, Jackson struck Chater, causing his nose to bleed. Jackson then forced Chater back inside the inn, and drinks were consumed so much that Galley and Chater were put into a room in a bed. The letter was stolen and destroyed after they learned Chater was going to give evidence against the already remanded John Diamond. John Race and Richard Kelly joined the band of smugglers, no doubt well oiled on rum and gin. A council of war took place between the smugglers. The first proposal was to murder them and throw them down a well. The second was to send them over to France, but this was decided against, as they may come back. Mrs. Jackson and Mrs. Carter said, "Hang the dogs, for they come here to hang us." The Hawkhurst decided that Galley and Chater would be taken away to be confined, and their fate would match Diamond's. "I'll shoot the person through the head should they mention anything that was done," said Edmund Richards, the Hawkhurst gang. Jackson went into the back room where Galley and Chater were sleeping. Jackson, with his spurs, climbed on top of the bed, waking Galley and Chater by running his spurs across their forehead. Jackson then whipped them with a horsewhip, and they produced themselves into the kitchen area, both bloodied. Galley and Chater were then taken outside. Richards announced to everyone else at the inn, with a pistol cocked in his hand, Jackson swore he would shoot anyone through the head that should mention anything of what was done. Mounted to the same horse, with their four legs tied together under the horse's belly, they then rode no more than 100 yards, and Jackson gave the order for the whipping to start. As they travelled, the whipping became so intense on Galley and Chater that they rolled under the horse's belly. As the horse moved, the hooves would strike Galley's and Chaytor's heads. The two men became so weak from the torture, they separated them onto different horses. Galley was so weak and in pain he pleaded to be put out of his misery. Jackson declined and continued the cruel torture. They then placed Galley across the pommel of the horse, described as a butcher does a calf. Galley cried out, "For God's sake, shoot him through the head." All the time Jackson was squeezing Galley's private parts. The smugglers and their mounted prisoners made for the Red Lion at Rake in Hampshire, where Benjamin Tapner joined the gang. The innkeeper was a man called Scardfield. Scardfield kept going about his business, tending to his fire and drawing liquor, saw a body laying on the ground. The gang then put Chaytor into the parlour and would not let Scardfield in, but he could see through a gap in the door that a man, that is Chaytor, stood there all blooded. A cover story was hatched by the members of the gang, telling Scardfield that some members of the gang had been killed in an engagement with the revenue and that the gang had lost a member. Jackson and little Harry moved to Chaytor, to old Richard Mills not far from Rake. The gang then consumed gin and rum. They got oiled and dug a grave for Galley. It's thought he may have been buried alive. Chaytor, whilst tied to a chain in a turf shed, had a knife run over his eyes and nose by Tapner. Chaytor and the now deceased Galley must have endured terrible torture, as the gang now plotted on how to dispatch Chaytor. They were debating responsibility by mounting a pistol at Chaytor's head whilst chained to a post and tying a piece of string to the trigger of the pistol and all jointly pulling the trigger, so they would all be jointly responsible for his death. Some of the gang objected to this, as it would put Chaytor out of his misery too soon. The sadistic torment did not stop. Tapner cutting Chaytor's forehead again, and a torrent of blood ran out down his face. Chaytor was then mounted onto a horse and taken to Harris's Well in Lady Holt Park. The cruelty continued as Tapner whipped Chaytor across the face, reopening his wounds. The gang arrived at the well in the dead of night. It's worth mentioning that the reason for the well, which would be and still is in the middle of nowhere, was for stagecoaches to stop en route for replenishment. The well would have hold plenty of water, being some 30 feet deep. Tapner dismounted Chaytor when they arrived at the well and tied a noose around Chaytor's neck using a rope. Tapner tied the other end of the makeshift noose to the rail of the well to create tension and then pushed Chaytor into the well. He only went knee deep into the well. Chaytor's weight was not enough to strangle him. Of course, execution by hanging relies on suffocation, not breaking of necks. This caused the smugglers a problem. After a time, Stringer, Kobe and Hammond pulled Chaytor's legs out of the well. Tapner untied the rope from the rail. They all then let go of Chaytor, who fell head first into the empty well. The gang stood by the well for some time in the dead of night and could still hear Chaytor groaning and breathing. The gang then concocted a story to fetch a ladder from a gardener nearby called Colne Beach. They returned with the ladder, but for some reason could not lift it over the rails. So they gathered logs and stones, as they could still hear Chaytor making groaning sounds, and threw the heavy objects down the well until they heard no more. The gang mounted their horses and went home. With such vicious murders, the government had to act. Pelham appointed the Duke of Richmond, victor of the Battle of Culloden, to hunt down the gang. New measures were introduced, such as witness protection, and only certain judges were allowed to hear cases. A special court was set up in Chichester, West Sussex, at the Guildhall, with prisoners under military guard, as the state reasserted its authority over the region. The gang were eventually arrested, convicted and hung at the Broil, Chichester. To mark the execution, a stone was left as a deterrent to others, and it is still there to this very day. In conclusion, we have to turn back to Gabriel Tonkin's last scene, leaving Rye under fire, who then went on to commit highway robbery of the London to Chester Mail and was hung for it. On the 26th of January 1749, the VOC ship Amsterdam was beached at Bulverhive Beach, Hastings, where it was wrecked by the Hawkhurst Gang, some of its silver, perhaps another branch of the Hawkhurst Gang, but this is only a suggestion. But one thing was for sure, the silver was never returned. Trip Stanford was tried for the murder of Thomas Carswell, the riding officer, but was found not guilty thanks to his wealth that paid for a defence that successfully argued he stated to the gang to retrieve the tea, not to kill Carswell. On the fateful night of 1740, Stanford went on to live a rich life as a free man. As for Jeremiah Curtis, who escaped from Newgate and fled to Boulogne, it has been suggested to me by an author and historian that he was later cited in Hawkhurst living as a lawyer on the name as Jeremiah Curtis. Thomas Slotch Lillywhite married Sarah Owen. Sarah was the daughter of Mary Owen, who was housemaid and mistress to none other than Cecil Bishop MP of Parham House. Thomas was pardoned for his part in the Poole raid, and he, with his wife, at 17 years old, were expecting a baby. That now concludes this video. If you like what you have heard, then please help the channel by hitting the like, comment and subscribe buttons, and watch out for spin-off stories about the Hawkhurst Gang not covered in this video. So take care and see you all soon. And remember, turn away if the gentlemen go by. Bye for now.